Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadali Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tada Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vaibhacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. My Dandavat Pranam devotees. So this is a brief conversation I'm having, not based on a particular question I was asked or anything, but just something I wanted to give some expression to, having been involved in a dialogue recently. So it's not unknown to many devotees who have been part of any sangha for any given period of time that there are situations historically, perhaps currently, that go on in institutions that are not really representative of the practice of pure bhakti. Some of these things that go on are deeply wounding both to the faith and the psychology of aspirants in those institutions. What happens as a result of that is not only a crisis of faith, but sometimes unhealed wounds which start to inform the perception about bhakti, bhaktas, the practice, and everything else. So when that happens, sometimes it's very difficult to see outside a person's personal pain. I'll give an example that when we are not feeling well, when we've had some physical trauma, then sometimes those things become the most dominant feature in our consciousness. So I'm giving two examples here. One is when I did have some experience with COVID, it was pretty intense and pretty long, and I remember getting up to do morning bhajan practice and really taking shelter of the practice more as a way to just mentally get away from the fact that I was really feeling weak, sick, etc., etc. So I was more or less just taking shelter, not so much with the normal depth of devotional experience, but it was really literally a kind of, just psychological reprieve from the suffering that was coming from going through being sick. Similarly, I was recently traveling for preaching, and I had a fall, and the fall apparently tore some muscles. I didn't break any bones, but I tore some muscles here, and it was really, 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 really painful. And I remember going to each of the programs, and I was taking shelter of doing Harikatha, because in the Harikatha you can get lost, so to speak, in speaking Harikatha, and I wouldn't think about the pain or anything. I remember when I arrived back home after traveling and everything, the pain was still really, really bad, which is natural with an injury like that. And I remember again sitting to chant in the morning, to do my morning Shwadhyaya, meaning just spiritual study, everything, and just looking for a mental reprieve from that pain. So my point here is that when we experience, Dandavat, Ganga Didi, Dandavat, both Gangas, two Gangas are on, so Dandavat Pranam to both of you. So when you're in any kind of personal distress, dis-ease, or trauma, your own sense of I-ness and self-interest do become prominent. Of course, in bhakti, we're trying to put our self-interest secondary to the interest of service to Sri Radhakrishna Yugla Mahaprabhu. But the fact is, when we do experience some trauma, when we experience physically or psychologically or otherwise, the sense of I-ness becomes prominent. And sometimes in that sense of I-ness, related to any particular traumatic psychological experience, especially because they're more lingering sometimes than physical experiences, the sense of I-ness becomes so dominant, it can obfuscate a kind of perception of things from other people's perspective and even as they actually are. But rather my sense of self-interest and I-ness becomes so dominant that I lock into that perception and I make that perception valid at all costs. So I'm giving another example. Many devotees who know me personally know that I had two careers, but obviously one of them was in law enforcement for more than 17 years. And in the course of law enforcement, I had various duties, obviously. But in the very beginning, I worked just like every other officer in uniform and so forth and so on. Maybe 2 years into doing that I took on an additional role, which was called a field training officer, which is when you take a person who's recently come out of the academy and you help to train them in actual day-to-day street experiences. So I was working with one person who had come out of the academy, a very nice young man, and we were doing some patrolling, and we were at a particular train station, and we went to the top side of the train station, and there were some people who were loitering there, and they were drinking, actually. And sitting back away from them, I had noticed that there was a lady sitting there. She was kind of part of the crowd, but there were just a few people lingering in the background, so to speak. And she had a dog. And she had her dog tied to one of the poles that are part of the fencing there. Apparently, the young man who was with me, he didn't see that. And we went to address the crowd of those who were in the larger group and were loitering and drinking and so forth. And the person who I was mentoring at that time was there, and we were discussing, and suddenly the dog just viciously started barking, and the trainee, he immediately pulled out his gun. And when he pulled his gun out, obviously the people who were sitting in close proximity to us, they completely panicked. So I said, well, what's up? What's going on? I thought he saw something, or perhaps something was happening. And I said, well, hey, what's going on? And he said, oh, nothing. And he put his gun away right away. So, of course, if you pulled your firearm, generally it's because there's some imminent threat of something is happening. You don't just pull a firearm. So I didn't want to address it right there and then. So we finished dealing with the crowd that we had to deal with, etc. And then as we went back into the station, I pulled him aside and, hey, we need to have a conversation. Like, what happened? Why did you pull your firearm? Well, he told me that he heard the dog barking. So I mentioned to him, well, yeah, I mean, dogs, they do that. They bark, or sometimes, they get excited. But, what would require you to pull a gun? Was the dog charging at you or something? Because I saw the dog was tied to the pole. He said, no, but what happened, he related a story to me that when he was a teenager, that his brother had a dog. And that one day he was just playing with the dog, and the dog just started barking and viciously attacked him and actually bit him in the face and, just got him pretty good. So he was explaining that when he heard the dog bark, it was just like a trigger for him, essentially. And he pulled his gun. So at first when we were having the conversation, I was explaining to him, wow, that was a horrific experience. But obviously you have to take into account, where you are, what you're doing, and the fact that having drawn your gun like that could have caused some, greater calamities than, just pulling the gun out. If somebody would have then thought something other than what you were thinking and made some, rash actions, and you shot him or something, or you caused me to draw my gun, right? And something happened and there was just some mistaken circumstances or something, it could have been not good as an outcome. So at first when he heard it, he began to rationalize, yes, but this is just something that's part of my personal experience. And he asked me literally, have you ever been attacked by a dog? Right? Of course that had happened, but I didn't have any severe triggers from it or anything. So I said, no, I fully understand, that circumstance. But you have to understand the circumstance that you are currently existing in, which is that you're around other people and you're carrying a firearm. And there's already an inherent danger that built into that whole ideal of you having a firearm, or any of us having a firearm, what to speak of allowing yourself to be triggered. Maybe that's something that you have to deal with to get healed, because that kind of triggering could cause very severe problems for you down the line. If you were to draw your gun accidentally, in response to that trigger of the barking, trip, fall, whatever it might be, pull the trigger and somebody is killed or injured from that, that's a problem. So after a while, he completely began to, yes, you're absolutely right. He kind of fell into agreement, consciously, because I think he was still digesting the triggering that had happened, and he couldn't really in the very beginning even understand the rationale of the overarching picture was that you drew a firearm, and there's many other people who have nothing to do with what happened in your personal experience, but they've suddenly become part of that because you were triggered by the event. So that's something you have to really deal with if you're going to work in this capacity. So I brought up that story because a similar thing can happen for many people who have been traumatized in some way, form, or fashion, having come especially to a process like bhakti, which is seen in its ideal light as exactly what it is, pure, absolute, loving truth. This is the actual nature of bhakti. But when we see the malapplication of that by those who themselves are not pure, loving, etc., and it leaves scarring and trauma in the psyche of aspirants, and then they become triggered by anything that is remotely related to that trauma, that again also is a problem. You understand? That also is a problem. So, of course, obviously, nobody is blaming victims for their traumatic experience. Absolutely not. But healing is important. If you have a trauma, physically even, if you don't go and get it attended to, get it treated, it may turn into an infection, more complications, etc., etc. In the same way, if you have a trauma and you don't actually heal from that trauma, and you still keep yourself more remotely or more directly in the presence of an atmosphere in which that trauma was produced for you, that's unhealthy. So you have to heal that traumatic experience to a degree that allows you to be in the environment where your trauma took place and keep an open perspective, an open perception about that environment. And it's been seen very clearly that there are many people who their trauma has not really been healed. And the trauma having not been healed, you get the additional psychological shielding that it comes organically with victimhood. Right? Again, as a law enforcement officer, there are many people who are victims of crime. And when you speak to them, they have a great degree of shielding. Shielding is because it was not their fault. Right? It was not their fault. So they have a shielding in the sense that they feel a certain sense of entitlement that whatever is going on, it all revolves around me right now, and I really don't care about anything else or anyone else in some cases. The world is really about me right now because I've been the victim of a crime, right? But sometimes you have to get people to first come back to a more neutral perception in order for them to see it is a fact that you've been a victim of a crime. But we still need to get details, we still need to get evidence, we still need to get circumstances, because you can't make a case on exactly just how you feel. Right now, and that's why sometimes, because, obviously in the career later on, I went to investigations and detectives and all these things, and I did many casework where I had to go and interview somebody, and sometimes it's just not the opportune time to interview them. Because the trauma still may be fresh, and therefore you might gather the necessary emergency evidence that you need to start putting the case together, but you may come back and give a more detailed interview at a later time, because that gives people time to, sort of begin to come back to a sense of normalcy from the trauma, so they can give expression to exactly what happened, and you can put together an actual case. So, in the same way, those who may have undergone traumatic experiences, and crises of faith is a deep psychological experience, because if you put your faith in something that you consider to be absolute, and then that's crushed by the disappointing behavior, especially when that behavior is predatory. In other words, somebody having their own struggle in bhakti, that's one kind of phenomenon. That's one kind of phenomenon. It may cause a crisis of faith, then that person may not necessarily be condemned, because people in their attempt to try in bhakti still may succumb to previous material impressions. But when that behavior becomes predatory, that's a problem, because you're in a social environment. And in that social environment, when your behavior crosses the boundaries and becomes predatory in any way, form, or fashion, it becomes a problem. So that kind of predatory behavior, that certainly has to be dealt with. My recommendation is always deal with it like it would be dealt with in any other environment where predatory behavior is dealt with. It should be legally dealt with by legal professionals and having a legal outcome. Right? Because trying to deal with it as an institutional concern, inclusive of, trying to deal with the psychology that might have produced the behavior and all those sort of things, that's one thing. Even that should be dealt with professionals, right? Let some professionals analyze what may have caused the predatory nature to arise and all these different things. But legal action has to be taken to both be a deterrent and also a preventative for that exact person to not do this again. You understand? So that's my take on that particular section. But for those who've been traumatized, they have to also heal. Because without healing, your perception of everything will be based out of the kind of I-ness and the sense of victimhood. And from the victimhood, the sense of victim shielding that takes place around that kind of psychology. In other words, I was victimized by something. I have the entitlement. Having been victimized, I have a special kind of entitlement. And that entitlement may sometimes give rise to my perception should be counted and considered as the only valid conception. And that everything else doesn't account for recognizing my victimhood, and therefore, whatever, it can be done away with. So I'm not really concerned about others, or other perceptions, or other people, or other circumstances. Only what I'm experiencing is paramount. And especially when you have groups of people who've had those similar experiences, they form a collective and mutually nourish that idea, it becomes extremely problematic. Because there's a mutual nourishing of the sense of victimhood, victim shielding, and the sense of not coming back to a whole perception or whole perspective, but maintaining that status and maintaining the openness of that sore. Now, part of sometimes being a victim of something is denial of the trauma engendered from that victimization. Because at the same time that we align with being a victim of something, we want to do away with the circumstances that produce that victimhood. That's why sometimes, particularly in a violent crime, it is difficult to get the victim to speak sometimes very direct, because in the direct speaking, it reawakens and triggers the experience of the event. So psychologically, this is one of the whole things you have to study in actual investigations and interviews and so forth and so on. You have to learn how to understand the different psychological phases of being a victim of something. So one phase of being a victim of something is the denial of some of the direct facts around it because they trigger the event again. Therefore, sometimes there's a sense of denying the trauma. No, I'm okay. No, nothing is wrong. But just like in the case of the young man I was mentoring or field training on the job, he had to get that particular psychological trigger from that trauma with the dog. He had to get that taken care of. Because even on the police department, you have canine units. And if you're responding to something and suddenly one of the canines begins to do that, what will you do? Pull your gun in that environment? So you have to actually heal the trauma and come back to whole perception. How long that may take for any individual, that's an individual experience. But it won't be helped when you make a consensus around the particular trauma and around the perceptions of victimhood and victim shielding that come from that trauma, and the perception you have about anything related or that triggers your remembrance of those kind of traumas. So I'm not speaking directly about the particular incident or thread or whatever. I'm not speaking directly about it. I'm just giving by example and by analysis how these things come about. That devotees or aspirants, especially who've been damaged by the malapplication of bhakti, while at the same time holding in high esteem the pure ideal of bhakti, because that's a certain psychological thing that doesn't happen in the secular world. In the secular world, people expect that the world is crazy. People are criminals. There's wanton violence. So people have an expectation. You just don't think it will happen to me. But those things are there in the world. But in a place that you consider a safe space, that's an ideal of love, spirituality, you don't expect these things to happen. And when they do happen, it's a deeper psychological trauma than when you have an expectation based on an environment that would be apropos for that kind of behavior. But when it happens in a truly spiritual environment, then obviously it's even more devastating. So one of the things is, however, as I'm reiterating something I just mentioned, when a consensus of many victims comes together and the essential healing element is not prominent, but more the element of reinforcement of all the things I mentioned, the trauma, the victimhood, the victim shielding, and the perception arising from that standard in the psychological makeup, that can become problematic. Because you come back into that same environment with only that perception. And anybody who says that their perception is not informed by the trauma is, like I mentioned before, somebody who may be denying that it's informing. So you may come back, for instance, obviously in law enforcement we come across many victims' rights groups. These are people who've been victims of crime or victims of domestic abuse or victims of any other kinds of trauma that had legal implications involved in it, and they form, or maybe it was a loved one. It may not have been them themselves, but a loved one who was a victim of crimes. So, and there's many kinds of victim advocacy groups. But because there are guidelines, there are legal guidelines, it allows that even if, and I gave this example actually in one of the threads, I don't mean to jump, but when I was working cases that involve the abuse of children or abuse of women, then because I'm married and I have a child, especially a daughter, those things were triggering for me because I have a wife and a daughter. So naturally, the posture of being an authority in law enforcement could give rise to overstepping the bounds because I have the ability, right, based on the posture of being a law enforcement officer, to overstep the bounds of what is legal, right, to exercise my own triggering by having had to deal with somebody who was in one of those cases. One case I worked was the abuse of an 11-year-old girl by a foreign national who was like 6'5", 280-something pounds, like a bodybuilder type person, who trapped a young girl in between the train seats and was abusing her. So obviously, when I got that case, the fumes, right, of the inner idea that I have a wife and I have a daughter were present. So those fumes, unchecked by guidelines of how to operate properly to come to a successful arrest, adjudication of that case, if those guidelines weren't there, that triggering could have led to me just finding that person, beating him to a pulp, etc., etc. You understand? But there are guidelines. And because there are guidelines, it allowed me to keep my own sense of being triggered by such a thing, because we had to interview that girl. We had to interview with her parents several times. And then as it happened, I actually was riding the train, ran across that guy. I was alone, right? I had a sketch, and I had known the person would attend the mosque on Fridays, right? This is just a generic thing. Obviously, he wasn't a serious practitioner of Islam, right, to do such a thing. But he would attend the Jummah, means the Friday prayer at the International Mosque. I had that feeling because the description was he was a foreign national. And I knew that most who practice Islam, foreign nationals, they go to that mosque. So I took the sketch, got on a train, and was going towards, in D.C., DuPont Circle, where that stop is for that mosque. Sure enough, ran into him on the train, talking to another woman, but it was a grown woman, but talking to this woman in French, which the young girl had described was the accent. It sounded French, and so forth and so on. And so, of course, I took him off at the stop. You know, I'm not going to mention how we took him off and all these kind of things, and I didn't breach any guidelines. I did what was according to training and everything else, right? But the point here being, if those guidelines were not in place, and I allowed my own perception of somebody who could do something like that to become the dominant perception at that moment, then I would have messed everything up, because I would have exercised my own individual anger, frustration, whatever, at somebody who would do such a thing, which would have then violated that person's rights to due process, etc., etc., and that would have ruined the case. Which, when having followed the guidelines, I successfully got that case adjudicated. He got deported is what happened, right? But anyways, that's the outcome you want. You want it to stop. You don't want to just get the initial satisfaction of exercising what triggered me. I want to do something to combat that feeling I have. So in the same way, where you have people who've experienced some serious trauma in relation to any Sangha, and they're still, because in their deepest recesses, know that Bhakti, Krishna is God, Bhakti is real, right? So they don't leave Bhakti altogether, but they still have very hard times dealing with the combination of being in the environment where there's a collective practice of Bhakti and having those traumas to deal with, right? But when you establish guidelines of how to deal with it, that becomes very helpful for being in the environment, championing a cause that it doesn't happen to others, and at the same time, because of the guidelines, not allowing your own trigger to overspill, and perhaps, like the training I had with the gun, get other people implicated in something that they had nothing to do with. So again, I'm not talking about the specifics of anything. If anybody knows the specifics, that's fine. So you can maybe have a more clear picture of what I'm describing, but also just in general conversation, this is important. That we have to somehow or another understand that there are other spiritual and social consequences to us living in a status where only our self-interest and I-ness and sense of trauma based in that is important. That there are other people, there are other circumstances, there are other considerations. Now sometimes, part of what happens also is a sense of making your perception less directly connected to your trauma than it actually is. So somebody will say, well, no, the reason that we have such things and the reason that we go after people in such a way is just as a, deterrent against this behavior from other people in the future. But I can't go and arrest somebody who looks like somebody who's committed a crime. You understand? You can't arrest somebody who looks like somebody in a similar circumstance who didn't commit a crime because somebody who does look like that did commit a crime. That's where guidelines come in. You have to adhere to the guideline that there are other people whose life experience is affected by what you do. And you can't dismiss the validity of their life experience because your trauma is more important. And you're extending and projecting your trauma into every other circumstance. So, for instance, anybody who displays any kind of affection to anyone, right? I may perceive that related to the kind of trauma I experienced by being abused or something. And now I will jump on that, and though circumstantially maybe nothing is happening. If it did, certainly you would gather facts, information, witnesses, so forth, and actually go after the actual event. If nothing happened, you cannot poster child people in order to attack the, quote, deterrent to such behavior. Because that person's life is impacted. And you can't say, oh, well, que sera, sera, right? That, they're the collateral damage of the genuine cause of championing victims' rights. I'm just using that as a generic term because I don't want to get into specifics. So you can't do that. You actually have to say, well, what would be the best method for dealing with this? Well, the best deterrent would be people who do such things to face consequences. And if those consequences are not being produced by the institution, then legal cases should be made. And the legal cases provide social consequences for those kind of actions. That's the actual solution. Solution is not, interinstitutional warfare. The victims against the perpetrators and those who support the perpetrators, etc., etc. No, the actual standard of consequences, you have to face legal consequence for this. Now again, there's something different between somebody who has difficulty controlling their senses or something, but it's non-predatory. Then we pray, hopefully by practice of bhakti, gradually all of us hopefully will unfold and we'll never have problems with controlling our senses. But if your behavior becomes predatory in any way, form, or fashion, or abusive in any way, form, or fashion, that has to have consequences. You understand? So, this is the actual mechanism for creating consequences and deterrent. The simple idea of, though claiming not to, satisfying part of my cathartic experience with this whole trauma by getting gotcha moments with other people that are perceived even to represent what I experienced, that's not helpful. And it actually detracts from the actual genuine cause. Because then it makes it seem like the actions are being manifested from trauma, not from genuine concern for victims. And that's not a difficult thing for people to see. Even if your own trauma is a little blinding and you being able to look back and see the truth about why you're taking certain actions, other people in a neutral perspective, they can see that. And rather than, therefore, getting people on board with your cause, you actually push people away from your cause because your cause then seems to be based more in your own individual trauma than it does in the genuine cause you're purporting to represent. So I don't want to make this extremely long. I wanted to present that because I think overall, and I think I've spoken to this before, that the psychological impact of the malapplication of bhakti has very devastating effects. Even when it doesn't have effects based in the seriousness of what we were talking about just now, sometimes it has less severe psychological impact on an aspirant, but still impact, where people then begin to doubt all kinds of things related to bhakti, which you need to place implicit faith in. You understand? Like, it came to a point where people began to question everything. They began to question motives about Srila Prabhupada in relation to racial discussions or discussions regarding women or other kinds of things. Right? So what happens is that in the less psychological depth of impact, for lack of a better word, people still have come to those kind of things. Or people who've had bad experiences with dealing with someone who performed the function of guru for them. And then in that function of guru, produce some inadequacy. Now there are cases where somebody may have been victimized by previous material impressions, rectified themselves, and according to all Sastra Praman, this is okay. But if the faith is broken from that, and it corrupts your ability to deepen your bhajan practice, then Shastras recommended you should again find Vaishnav and take Diksha or initiation there, and then go on in your bhakti with no ill will towards that previous person. Where there is abuse of that, where it's, well, no, there's denial, there is non-acceptance of the being overrun by your previous material impressions, and there's sort of denial, then that person should just be given up. They should just be given up, right? So, but the point here is that whether it's something in that vein or whether it's something much more in line with both criminal activity and devotional trauma, then we have to heal. And part of that healing is being in a kind of association that is healing. And where we may think that being in a group where there's a consensus around the kind of trauma we experience and the sense of victimhood and victim shielding, etc., that's not always healing. It certainly may be okay to acknowledge that we have a similar trauma, right? But nobody goes to a hospital to take up permanent residence. We go to a hospital to be healed. And at a certain point, part of the healing process is coming out of the hospital and coming back into the natural environment. So if you perpetuate the, quote, healing modality by reaffirming the trauma over and over again with other people who've had that trauma, that's not healing. You have to get into an environment that, again, and the best healing medicine is bhakti. The very thing that we understood to be the pure loving reality is the true healing mechanism. So to be around those who genuinely, by their behavior and their practice, engender in us the spirit of true bhakti, that's true healing. And if necessary, to take up any other kind of association, whether it be psychological, sociological, professional help, because in some cases that may also be genuinely needed. So to do those things in tandem, certainly is helpful to us getting back on track. Understand? So I've kind of entered into many different portals here, and obviously I'm speaking with some ambiguity because I'm not trying to address directly the circumstance which spawned the conversation, and I beg that you understand that. But I think there's enough here to understand, in general, even if you don't know exactly the circumstances being talked about, how the phrasing of the things I was saying speak to a general idea also, especially within Vaishnav Sanghas, right? And I didn't specify any particular Sangha because this is universal in application, all right? All right, I think I will leave it there. My Dandavat Pranam to devotees who came on. Of course, when I record these things, it's only for my own edification, for one, as I always say, and also to make it available for those who have the desire to hear and try to digest these things, right? And for those who directly come on and listen, then that's your causeless mercy on me. Most of the time, many of those are friends and associates who listen to when I'm regularly doing Hari Katha. And again, this is a little separate from doing Hari Katha, but the pragmatics of practice are as important to practice as the ideals of the practice. The ideals of the practice will be absorbed in Nam, Shri Hari Katha, etc. But the pragmatics of practices we have to get from point A to point B. And sometimes discussions like this are very helpful in that manner. All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhuvevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Shri Radhe Radhe.